Welcome, everyone. My name is Lois Black, and I'm Director of Library Special Collections at the Lehigh University Libraries. On behalf of Boaz Nadav Manas, University Librarian, and the Friends of the Lehigh University Libraries, who are sponsoring today's program, I'd like to thank you for joining us today and to bring you up to date on several of our recent events. Over the years, the Friends have provided support for initiatives ranging from book conservation to visits by major authors and exhibits. In addition, the group sponsors a faculty authors reception during the fall semester. Please follow the link in the chat to learn more about the Friends and to find recordings of recent programs they've sponsored. The Lehigh Libraries is celebrating its acquisition of the Robert Lichtman Science Fiction Fanzine collection with a spring exhibit of fanzines, Lichtman archival material, and foundational science fiction literature, with a particular focus on AI. While the physical exhibit is currently displayed in Linderman Library and coming soon to Fairchild Martindale Library in April, you're invited to visit the virtual Lichtman exhibit online. Please check the site for news of additional programming that will take place in the coming weeks. And we have links to all of the above in the chat, so please do take note and visit us. Today's program is a partnership between the Friends of the Lehigh University Libraries and the Lehigh University Press. Academic libraries and university presses have a lot in common. This is undoubtedly true also here at Lehigh. We share a mission to deeply enhance research activities at Lehigh and beyond. We believe the importance of open and accessible knowledge sharing across our community and strongly support interdisciplinary conversations, academic integrity, relevancy, and innovation. In that spirit, the libraries and the press seek practical ways to collaborate. For example, we have moved the LU Press office back to Linderman, where it originally started, and the LU Press board now meets within our library walls, where its managing editor's office is located. We believe that this affinity in space also strongly signals a greater shared commitment in other ways. On Boaz's behalf, I'm delighted to announce today what we hope will become an annual Friends of the Libraries event in which the LU Press sheds light on its recent publications and activities. Please enjoy this exciting inaugural program, and please share the good word about the press and its work. Without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce Nate Carpenter, Managing Editor of the Lehigh University Press, who will introduce today's speaker, Richard Smith, and will moderate the question and answer period following Richard's talk. Nate.
Thank you, Lois, so much for the background and introduction. I'd also like to thank the Friends of the Lehigh Library for putting on these really excellent webinars in the speaker series, and for inviting Lehigh University Press to participate and collaborate in the series. And although Boaz couldn't be here tonight, I certainly wanted to thank him as well as a university librarian and as a board member of Lehigh University Press. He's worked, as Lois noted, to build a stronger relationship between Lehigh University Press and Lehigh University Libraries. Support for the humanities and for social sciences research is as important now as it has ever been. And I think it's a testament to Lehigh's commitment to advancing research that it has supported Lehigh University Press in its mission to publish books that advance our understanding of our world. The press has, for 40 years now, been publishing monographs and edited collections, and importantly, primary source materials in the fields of the humanities and social sciences. And the publication of primary source materials is particularly interesting and important because what that does is it takes what otherwise might remain as archival materials and makes those available to a wider audience. Materials such as that discovered by Richard Upsher Smith, which documents mundane and extraordinary experiences of war. Dr. Richard Upsher Smith is retired professor of classics at the Franciscan University of Steubenville, retired and very active. In fact, his current book is forthcoming this year by the Franciscan University Press, entitled The Catholic Holy Sites of the Mohawk Valley, the True Locations of the Deaths of the Jesuit Martyrs and the Birth and Upbringing of St. Catherine Tekakwitha. Tonight, however, he's going to be talking about his work on and his discovery of a Civil War correspondence of two Pennsylvanians and the correspondence between themselves and their connections. Work that he published as a Quaker colonel, his fiancée, and their connections, Selected Civil War Correspondence, which was published by Lehigh University Press in 2023. And so it's with great pleasure that I invite Dr. Upsher Smith to this Friends of the Lehigh University Libraries speaker series. Welcome, Richard, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Nate. I'd like to begin by thanking Lois Black and, of course, Nate, who has, this is the second time I've actually worked with him, and also Jen McAvoy, who was the very competent event coordinator. And also, too, just in passing, the university librarian, Boaz Manes. And also Dr. Kate Crassens, who saw this book through the press very competently and with a stiff upper lip in dealing with me. So what kind of a book is this, A Quaker Colonel, His Fiancée, and Their Connections? It's a collection of letters exchanged during the Civil War by a young man named Charles Burleigh Lamborn, and it's a little hard to tell whether she was really already his fiancée at the beginning of the war or what, but they certainly became engaged, and at the end of the war were married. And the book also includes a number of letters from members of their families and from friends and other connections. This smaller collection, which is from 1861 to 1865, contains 646 letters, 269 of which are published in this book. The entire collection starts in 1808 and goes through to the beginning of the 19th century. It covers almost 100 years of these two families, the Lamborns and the Taylors. And it was made by Emma Taylor Lamborn, as she became, and was discovered actually by my wife, and then came to me through her. One of the, perhaps the blind reader for the press in assessing my manuscript suggested that it contained a northern answer to the great 1972 collection of southern Georgia family letters published by Robert Manson Myers called The Children of Pride, which in the edition I own is 3 volumes, 1,200 out of 6,000 letters that were written between 1854 and 1868. I was flattered by this comparison, or perhaps, in fact, the Taylors and Lamborns should have been flattered. And like Manson, I think this, my collection here can be read as an epistolary novel. Manson actually edited his letters with an eye towards making it readable, like a novel of Richardson written in letters. And once I found out about Manson, about Myers, I made some effort in the radical editing that took place during the during the publishing process to also try to make it into a epistolary novel. And it is, in fact, novelistic in a way. I have to emphasize the fact that these are historical letters, but you do find the story of two families and their connections told primarily through the letters of these two young members of the families. You have a good main story with several subplots going. You have strong character delineation as well as development over the 4 years. There's considerable suspense. I mean, we know how the war turns out, but we don't know who's going to survive. The reader also learns a good deal about life, I think, and perhaps also about himself or herself. And finally, it tells the story of an historical event, the Civil War, better than a history book in many ways. As I think Tolstoy tells the story of the invasion of Russia better than many historians do. And also my annotations complete the picture that the reader may, the non-specialist reader may need filled in. My talk, therefore, and this is actually a brainstorm I had this morning, so I'm not sure how this will work, but my talk is going to be an attempt to work out this, to look at the book as an epistolary novel, drawing out some of these factors that I have pointed out in the novel, in a novel. There are other ways, certainly, to read this book, and specialists might attend not only to the military aspects, which are widespread in the book. There is considerable information on African Americans, both free and slave. There is very interesting material on guerrilla warfare, both in Virginia and down south, and I knew little about that. Because of the connections of these two families in the railroad and steel business and in politics, there is a great deal to be gleaned on the military-industrial political complex to spin off on President Eisenhower. And there's also a great deal about, camp life in the military, about medicine, military medicine, because one of Emma's brothers was a military doctor. There's a great deal about logistics. So the book can be read in any number of ways, and certainly I think would be of interest to a number of people. But today I'm going to try to show its interest as a kind of epistolary novel. Charles Burleigh Lamborn lived from 1837 to 1902, and Emma Taylor lived from 1834 to 1916. We'll call Charles Charlie and Emma. That's what they called each other. She also often, she was fluent in German, and they had her sister-in-law was German. She traveled there. They had many connections there, and she often called him Carl. So we may find that in the letters that I read. The Lamborns were Quaker. They had been there since the time of William Penn in Chester County. His mother, who was his father's second wife, his first wife died soon after childbirth. His mother, Charlie's mother, Rachel Pierce Lamborn, was an ardent abolitionist. They ran out of their home. They ran a stop on the Underground Railroad. She was also a botanist, if I recall. She was certainly a scientist. I believe she was a botanist. She had very intimate connections in the abolitionist and women's rights movements. One person in particular will show up in these letters named Patty Kimber. Her real name was Martha, but in those days, apparently Patty was a nickname for Martha. And she herself was a mathematician. Her sister Abby was more famous, and she was a botanist and is remembered as such in local histories. And they were also ardent abolitionists and women's rights activists. And I think they may have, well, they certainly were connected with Lucretia Mott and others like that. They were progressive friends, the Lamborns. His father was a Hicksite friend, so they broke away from the traditional Quakers that flourished in Philadelphia. And yet they kept the pacifist tradition. At least Charlie's father did. Charlie himself and many other Quakers of his generation in particular did not. And I think this may be because in Hicksite progressive Quakerism, the issue of abolitionism and other political issues like that began to trump pacifism. Nevertheless, we do find Charlie's father right after Fort Sumter, and just about the time that Charlie was enlisting, we find the elderly man writing him. I know the zeal of young persons is sometimes very strong, and the desire to be doing something that is deemed praiseworthy is very strong. And any hesitation just at this time visibly manifested by a young man against stepping forward into the ranks and offering himself as food for powder and ball, or as a target to be shot at, may seem to be at first thought to be wanting in patriotism. Nevertheless, there are many other manly and noble duties equally necessary and equally useful, even at this very critical time, to claim the time and attention of the young men. And I therefore very earnestly desire thee will not consent to join any volunteer company or any other band whose main object is to kill men, as it is one of the last and lowest callings that a rational being should embark on. So that's his father's plea to him to maintain his status as a pacifist Quaker, which I think Charlie actually never did entertain. He was certainly more than courteous to his father and respectful, but he did not even pretend to want to remain a pacifist. A number of other influences are present in their background. I'll just mention one more, which is that Emma, well, I should say that the Taylors were not Quakers. Emma's father had been raised Quaker, but he married a Lutheran woman from Lancaster County, and thus was kicked out of the meeting. She didn't become Quaker, and he was kicked out of the meeting, which was common at the time. And yet they did attend the Progressive Meeting House at Pierce Park, which is now, of course, the great Longwood Gardens. But Pierce Park is actually where Charlie's mother grew up. She was Rachel Pierce. So there's that connection there too. And you can still go to Longwood Meeting. It's a museum now. And you can find the graves of most of these people in the Longwood Meeting graveyard there, just outside of Longwood Gardens. But Rebecca Way Taylor was, and a lot of the Taylor women in the family were literary, very literary. One of the elderly farm women in the family taught herself German and Italian so she could read Goethe and Dante in the original. These are the kinds of people that we're dealing with, and what these Quaker women were like. They were extraordinary people. Anyway, Rebecca Way Taylor, raised her son Bayard to be a literary man, really, and which he became. He was in his time. He was a very famous journalist, poet, novelist, lecturer, travel writer. He traveled the world, literally around the world. Was with Admiral Perry when he entered Japan and so forth. So this really goes back into this admiration for literature that animated the Quaker tradition in this particular part of the world, at any rate. So in 1861, Charlie leaves his law studies in Westchester, Chester County, Pennsylvania, and joins the local militia company called the Brandywine Guards, named after the local river where the great battle was fought during the Revolution. The Brandywine Guards were incorporated into the 1st, or what was also called the 30th Regiment of the Pennsylvania Reserve Volunteer Corps, and they went to Camp Wayne, which was really just the Chester County Fairgrounds. outside of Westchester. Now he writes amusingly of this to Emma. He says, "The truth is, we didn't go to Easton, nor to Chambersburg, nor to Harrisburg, nor to Pittsburgh, nor to any other burg, but simply and flatly to Camp Wayne, Chester County Fairgrounds, within gunshot of our old quarters at home. I assure you there was no poetry about our being sent here. It was all conducted in the prosiest manner possible. Our men were very much provoked at first, but they soon became satisfied and now are really glad that they were not sent abroad to lay in camp. Captain McIntyre, now Lieutenant Colonel McIntyre, was placed in command of the camp, I acting as its adjutant pro tem. We adopted most stringent rules and compelled the men to remain in camp and perform their duties to the letter. The result has been we have all the advantages of camp, as well as the advantages of nearness to home. The latter shows itself in the large quantities of extra rations, pies, butter, milk, cream, ham, preserves, strawberries, etc., etc. Remember, this is like a 22-year-old man. He's got an appetite. For 2 or 3 evenings in succession, I've been at a strawberry supper. They are very abundant and very excellent. Our life here in other respects is a very lively one." And he continues with this amusing account of his first days in the military. We find the women's reactions are somewhat ambivalent, but not unsupportive. And this is a letter actually written by Patty Kimber to Emma Taylor when she learned of Charlie's enlistment. She says, "The brave soldier boy, Charlie, must go where duty calls, and the friends he leaves behind him must prove their loving hearts by bidding him Godspeed as bravely as love and patriotism only can. It is so brave in him to step thus forward at once, when his country calls. Then let his chosen bride, now in the hour of her trial, prove herself worthy of him. I do not write this because I doubt thee, Em, no indeed. I know thee will do thy part and give the soldiers due reward. I only intended to say, I sorrow for thee now." And this is something that is consistent about the women in this, the women's attitudes or feelings, that they seem to, the men often seem to feel, or at least admit to, only the upbeat emotions, while the women are much more subtle, I think, frequently about their emotions. They're not less patriotic, they're just subtler, I think. Emma's brother, Fred, rode around the Kennett Square area and recruited a whole company of riflemen, most of whom were Quaker, which again causes reflection. He marched them up to Camp Curtin near Harrisburg, where they joined the 13th or 42nd Regiment of the Pennsylvania Reserve Volunteer Corps, the very famous 1st Bucktails. One of the possibly one of the greatest, well, for surely one of the greatest regiments in the Army of the Potomac. All of them had to re-enlist or didn't have to, but they decided to re-enlist for 3 years in July of 1861, and then were incorporated into the Army of the Potomac, the entire Pennsylvania Reserves. I think it might have been 30 regiments. I can't remember. No, it might have been 13 regiments. At any rate, we then find a good deal of about the Army of the Potomac over the next years until 1863, when Charlie resigned and went out west to join a cavalry regiment there. We find, for example, again, his upbeat manner, or his upbeat emotions, evident in this account of his camp life, or their camp life in Tenallytown, which is now a suburb of Washington. Not a suburb, it's now a neighborhood in Washington, D.C. He says, writing Emma, "When I returned tonight from Washington after a whole day in the saddle, I was delighted to find lying on my table a letter endorsed by the hand I immediately recognized as yours. It was just sunset, the drums beat retreat, and the regiment was falling in for dress parade. Governor Curtin and lady and the governor's aides were here, and they were to be present at parade. It was impossible to devour the precious morsel as I most earnestly wanted to, so I thrust it in my pocket, put on my military toggery, and went down to form the line of 1,000 men. The dignitaries came out to view us, the drums ruffled, the lines presented arms, the officers saluted, the flag drooped, and the doughty governor, he took off his hat. At which wondrous movement the men cheered with becoming vigor. These dexterous evolutions being concluded, the parade was dismissed, and I, forgetting governors, colonels, parades, and all the pomp of war, came to my own private tent, lighted a candle, closed the linen walls about me, shut my ears to the murmurs of the camp, and sat down to think of you, of Cedarcroft, and of home. War has yet made but few changes in the domestic and social life of our people. God only knows what the future may bear them. Here we breathe an atmosphere of change. We are constantly shifting. Even as I write now, 10 p.m., a battery of light artillery rumbles along the turnpike 50 yards to my right, on its way to join the column of General Banks. The shrill notes of the bugle commands them to forward, and they hurry away at a rapid pace, and I see from my tent the fire flying from the horses' hoofs and the bright brass cannon glistening in the moonlight. These movements are so common that no one notices them. Regiments are moved from place to place every day. All expect it, and the order creates no unusual excitement. This recognition of change is there throughout the letters, and which might make a little paper all on its own. Emma, on the other hand, is party to what's going on at home, and has heard that rumors that Charlie has been losing his temper at his men, and has not been behaving as an elected officer should. Remember, at the beginning of the war, the Northern officers are still elected and were meant to be more politicians probably than officers. At any rate, she writes to him, having not heard from him some time after her first letter on this subject. She says, must I understand by your long silence towards me that you cannot in your heart forgive me the cruel words that I wrote you? I have looked in vain for a letter for many nights past, and now a feeling of remorse and repentance has seized me. You must understand why I wrote you as I did. In all this manner I judged you by myself, but I should not have written you when I was troubled and excited. It seemed to me then that your life is in danger, and I could not soon enough tell you all that I wanted to say. And what I felt may have been so imperfectly told that you could not see nor feel the kindness that I intended. It was not that I nor any of us believed these rumors. We did not, any of us. We were indignant and troubled for your sake. And that if you had been impatient or out of humor, which you certainly all, or very often, you see there is a confirmation of something that may be at the heart of all these rumors, it had been remembered by some of those jealous of your position. And that is certainly true, that there was a lot of social competition in these regiments at the beginning of the war. And so it had gone so far that I had no comfort at all that day until I had written you. So we see there a woman who can be very frank with the man who's going to become her fiance in the next year. I think a relationship that is actually developing in its capacity to for mutual advice and mutual support and that kind of thing. We find out from Charlie a little bit about the Peninsular Campaign in which he was involved, and Second Bull Run and Groveton and Second Bull Run in which he was involved. Not as much as we would like, because so much of his correspondence from this year is lost. At one point, Emma asked him to send her some buttons from his uniform coat, his tunic, to make jewelry out of. And he was, as General Reynolds' aide de camp, which he became, and as extremely busy. He only got around to this after the Battle of Second Bull Run. But in sending her the letters, he also composed a history of the two buttons, which is it's amusing. It's at least funny, I think. Perhaps not the. Oh dear, I'm sorry, I'm on the wrong page here. Perhaps not the greatest of humor, but it's amusing. He says, the true and faithful history of two buttons. Number one, a large staff button, supposed to be brass, bearing the device of an eagle rampant and circled with 24 stars of the kind worn by general and staff officers in the Army of the United States. The button is remarkable for having been sewed on a coat by an employee of Noah Walker and Company Clothiers of Baltimore. The coat was made of pilot cloth, was cut to order, well made up and serviceable. The coat was single-breasted, and this button was one of 6, firmly fastened to the right side, with black patent thread. When new, this button glittered like burnished gold, and was greatly admired by all. But the experiences of camp life were not suited to its complexion, and it soon became tarnished and like any other button. This button was in the field first attached to the army of the Rappahannock, and deported itself creditably in the Department of Passes in the military governorship of Fredericksburg, Virginia. It afterwards joined the Army of the Potomac on the banks of the Chickahominy. It first smelled powder in the Battle of Mechanicsville on June 26, 1862, and on the day following accompanied its owner with some rapidity from the field at the close of the Battle of Gaines' Mill, after which it changed its base, which was General McClellan's euphemism for retreating across the peninsula. It changed its base to the James River. It was present in the smoke and fire of Newmarket Crossroads and was a looker-on at Malvern. Disgusted with the damps and fevers of Harrison's Landing, Virginia, and the malaria of James River, and the sluggish life of the army thereon, this button returned to Fredericksburg and joined the army, which knew no lines of retreat. Advanced and joining the army, which knew the lines of retreat, advanced on Washington. This was Pope. General Pope was brought in from the west, and he advised the Army of the Potomac that he would know no lines of retreat, and immediately got beaten and had to retreat to Washington. This is what Charlie is very bitter about here. Actually, his humor is quite bitter. It renewed its acquaintance with Butternuts at Groveton and the Second Bull Run, and finally returned to Washington with many others. Here ended its military career, henceforth may it rust in peace. Number 2, staff button is above, smaller size, accompanied number 1 in its marches and retreats, particularly the latter, as they seem to occupy the greater portion of the summer. This button adorned the right cuff of the pilot cloth coat and ran many imminent risks of losing its eye. It was particularly in danger at the Second Battle of Bull Run. Many shells exploded near it, and many balls brushed it as they passed. But this button escaped unharmed, though a ball cut through the heavy coat close beside it. And Charlie was actually wounded. Further than this, its experiences are unworthy of note. Both these buttons have the distinguished honor of sharing the dangers and glories of the celebrated Pennsylvania Reserve Corps, and of having served in the field on the staff of General John F. Reynolds. If you know anything about these battles of the peninsula and of the retreat, the advance on Washington, you know what dangers Charlie ran. And actually, in the book, there are quotations from commendations that he earned from his commanding officers. He was a very brave, if not generally well-liked officer in his regiment. We do find also, the other hand, there is the bitter sarcasm, but generally there is a sort of refusal to admit, I think, a fear and or at least to talk about it with others. Whereas we find Emma writing actually during the Second Battle of Bull Run a much more nuanced letter, and this again gives you the mutual experiences of two people who love each other, going through the same experience in different places. I guess, in a sense, what you'd have to say. She writes, And this is actually during the Battle of Second Bull Run. The enclosed scraps written some days ago I have kept until now, not knowing how soon you would get a letter in these days of terrific battles. I feel quite sure this morning that you are safe. It is terrible to look over the list of names when the paper comes, and as there is no mention of you or Reynolds, I feel that you are among the saved. There is one statement of Reynolds and his staff that the division was driven back and was not rallied. This is not true. It's newspaper falsehood. But that the general and staff remained on the field watching the battle. If all this is true, then you've not been much engaged. In fact, at this battle, Charlie rescued a fellow officer who was commanding a battery of artillery. His men were driven off by the advancing Confederates. He was wounded badly in the chest. And Charlie actually rode in, took the man up on his horse, and then galloped away from the Confederates who were overwhelming the battery. An extremely brave and courageous act, I think. But how little we can believe that comes through the papers and the first reports. This must be the last great struggle. It is frightful and desperate. It must end here. Either we are lost or the rebels are dead forever. Are you reinforced? Have you fresh troops? Oh, my dear Carl, we are so far away, so quiet and tranquil this morning after the storm of last night, while you have around you suffering and death in the noblest cause. The country will be saved. It cannot be lost as long as God gives us brave men to suffer and die. I sorrow with all those who've lost their dearest and best. How the list lengthens out, and there will be many more names added before the work is finished. You see again how aware she is of the entire picture. And I'm sure Charlie was not unaware, but perhaps because he was in the midst of it, he couldn't allow those feelings to come out. I don't know really what the difference is, but there is this nuance in Emma's letters. She was, of course, a very poetic person, and I think had a kind of sensitivity to such things that many people may not have. Anyway, we continue through the year and into 1863 with the Army of the Potomac. And during this period, we also find that the women of the North, and I'm sure the same is true in the South, begin to play their role in the war effort in a period, of course, when medicine and manufacturing of medical supplies and even of clothing, uniforms, was lingering well beyond the capacity to kill and maim. The upper and upper middle class women, which we are talking about here, certainly found that their domestic work was now more onerous. Annie Taylor, Emma's sister, for instance, had to take over her brother Fred's farm. There was no one else to run it. The parents were too old at that point. So Annie, who was still in her 20s, mid-20s probably, had to take over and manage two field hands and so forth, and the livestock and so forth, the planting. Emma had to look after the house. She lived in her a quarter of a mile away in her brother Byard's mansion with her parents, and Byard and his family were often away. And she had to undertake a number of unaccustomed tasks, including raising chickens, ducks, and turkeys. And there's a great deal in the letters, not entirely represented in the book, but throughout the letters, there's a great deal about ducks, chickens, and turkeys. But there's one very amusing story in retrospect, which could have ended tragically, of her trying to gear, as they called it then, or harness a horse to a wagon. She writes Charlie, "Dear Carl, letter number 4 might have been the last letter that you would have received from me. You know, I told you I was going to carry it to the square. I put it in my pocket and went out to go. Thought I would drive Ben, as it was getting late. There was no one to gear him. I did it myself, with slight assistance from Lizzie Temple. I knew there was something wrong in the gearing, but I said to myself, it is Ben, and he is so safe. However, just as I drove into the road and commenced to go down the hill, Ben started to run, the wagon coming upon his heels. I tried to hold him, but could not. It only made it worse. And my only safety would be, I thought, in jumping out. She would have been wearing not a hoop skirt. She would have been wearing a work dress. So at least she didn't have hoops to manage in this. She makes this point about her clothing in other letters, which I did, making a terrible effort to clear the wheels. I came heavily and stunningly into the sand, the lines being around my hands. It stopped Ben, fortunately, and I sprang up quickly as quickly as I was down and caught him by the head. He was as much frightened as I, and we both thought it would be better to go home and get over the fright. So, I mean, that's, if you read any, any 18th, 19th century history and so forth, you find the number of riding and coaching accidents is with terrible injuries. It's actually quite high, probably at least as high as it is for motorcycle. Motoring accidents in contemporary times, maybe even higher. Well, that's just homework. Women also contributed immensely, I think one has to say, to the war work. They contributed, first of all, of course, to their own relatives and friends by packing boxes of pickles and biscuits and cakes and cigars and newspapers and magazines and other things, anything that would survive, and put them in boxes and sent them to their relatives and friends at the front. They would knit socks. Mrs. Taylor knit for her son Fred, knit a pair of socks with the rebel flag in the sole. So he would tread on the rebel flag every day with every step. So that's one of the things they did. But through the ladies' aid societies, which really picked up where the abolitionist ladies' societies left off, they got together in sewing circles and sewed clothes and knitted various articles for the soldiers at the front. They also made berry brandies, preserves, shirts, underwear for the sick and wounded soldiers in the various military hospitals. The Ladies' Aid Society, these societies were various villages and towns all over the North. They would put on benefit dances and entertainments, which made money and also kept up spirits. They also nursed in military hospitals. That woman, Lizzie Temple, who was mentioned in one letter, became a nurse working under Dorothea Dix in Washington, where she actually unfortunately died. The major part of the nursing of sick and wounded soldiers actually fell on their mothers, wives, and sisters, because they didn't spend long in hospital. And they were sent home, and there they either got better or died. And that was an enormous contribution that women made. In the 1864, many of these more local women's efforts were drawn together in the sanitary fair movement. There are big sanitary fairs in Chicago, New York, probably Boston, Philadelphia, which made tons of money for the so-called, as they called it in those days, the sanitary needs of the soldiers, which included clothing, medical needs, all that kind of stuff. And the women in these letters were very, very much involved in all of these events. They would even get involved in politics by buttonholing voters, men, of course, in those days. They actually did sometimes complain in their letters that they should be allowed to vote, especially in the 1862 elections, when men at the front were not allowed to vote. And they said, we should be allowed to vote at home. But anyway, Emma in the 1864 elections writes Charlie, I met William Thompson in the road today and told him that he must vote for Lincoln. Someone said he had stated that he could not vote for Lincoln because he treated John C. Fremont badly. I told him that it was his duty as a citizen. And then I felt so angry because he was so stupid. So I told him if he did not vote for Lincoln, he was no better than a copperhead. How desperate are these non-voters at home? The country might be lost and they would not care. I kiss you good night. So these women despite their lack of certain rights, made their thoughts and feelings only too clear to their communities. There are other activities which I could detail, but I think we probably should be pushing ahead now. I think we've been at it about a half hour now, probably. In 1861, William Jackson Palmer, who was a childhood friend of the Lamborn boys, and was also a railroad man. And he actually organized the rail connection between Annapolis, Maryland, and Washington, D.C. when Washington had been cut off in 1861, right after Fort Sumter from the north. So he's a very important figure. He actually went on and he founded Colorado City. Is that right? Yeah, I think Colorado City, Colorado. But anyway, he formed a headquarters guard, cavalry guard for General Anderson out in Kentucky. And then after the Battle of Shiloh, he was authorized to recruit it to the size of a regiment back in Pennsylvania, and it became the 15th Pennsylvania Volunteer Cavalry. But it kept its name as the Anderson Cavalry, and the old one. The smaller organization had been the Anderson Troop. This regiment mutinied at the time of the Battle of Stones River in the very late 1862 in Tennessee, when they were ordered to take part in ordinary cavalry maneuvers and operations in the battle, and all but 300 of the men of the regiment refused. They mutinied because they said they had not been recruited for regular cavalry service, but for headquarters service. One of the 300 men who did go into battle was Patty Kimber's nephew, Willie Kimber, Sergeant Willie Kimber, who was killed. And we find at the end of 1863 a very sad letter noting not only Willie Kimber's death, but her own brother Fred's death at Gettysburg. We have very little from 1863 in the way of letters in this collection. But we do know that Fred was killed leading the Bucktails on July 3rd, perhaps, actually at the foot of Little Round Top, or no, sort of Big Round Top, I think it was. But Patty Kimber writes at the very end of the year to Harry Lamborn, Charlie's brother, that she has received a letter from Emma. And she states, Emma tells of the Christmas Eve and the trees and the joy of the juveniles. Then, quote, through all the children's joy, there came many sad remembrances before me. Last Christmas on the Rappahannock, our dear Fred was having the Christmas cheer with good things from home. Last night I thought of Charlie far away in Tennessee and of her own Christ child in heaven. It was very sad for mother, but thee knows how strong she is, how her faith in God's goodness supports her. I know that Annie, that's her sister, thoughts are with us today. I had such a beautiful letter from her since I was in Philadelphia. And then she speaks of Sally Bolton's death. This is a friend of hers who had just died, but in 1858, I think it was, Fred, Annie, and Emma, and Bayard Taylor had all taken a year's trip in Europe and had spent Christmas with Annie Taylor's family in Geneva, Switzerland, where Sally Bolton's father was the attaché. And so Emma continues, 7 years ago today, we were a happy band around her father's hearth in Geneva. All were merry, singing songs of home under the mistletoe and holly. How great are the changes that pass along through life. I never felt them as I do now. This war has brought so much sadness and sorrow that our afterlife will be always tinged with a quiet sorrow, as these festal days bring back to us the faces and voices of the dear ones gone before. I feel much better. I shall be entirely well, I think, if I get a letter from Charlie this morning. again, I think that speaks very much to our own day and all the casualties that, at least out here in the Midwest, have been suffered by our contemporaries. For Eddie, before Charlie went west, in fact, on his way west to take up his new position as Lieutenant Colonel of the 15th Pennsylvania Cavalry, he stopped in Westchester, or actually stopped in Kennett Square, and got engaged to Emma. I think while it may slow us down a bit, and not appeal to people who really want to hear about battles, I think it says a great deal about the growth of these people as persons and the growth of their relationship. And I believe I should read it. She writes, and he's now gone west and they've become engaged. There is so much love and feeling in my heart for you today that I find no words of expression. Your unexpected note and pictures I found under my plate when I came home from school on Friday night. She's teaching in Westchester. I went alone to my room to read and kiss the words, so fresh from your heart and hand. Dearest heart, I never felt before when you left me, as I have done this time. I never lived through such mingled happiness and sadness. There again, the ambivalence, the capacity to feel both sides. The struggle has been great. I thought that I could not bear your going so far away into such danger. You will think of me as your brave girl when you know how hard it was for me to fulfill my duties through the long days of the past week. Your face was always before me, your tender, noble words of love always echoing in my heart. I am not unhappy, but I have been so sad, so anxious, so hopeful that God will watch over you there, as he has done here in danger. I was startled to see you on Tuesday morning. I woke early thinking that you were in Philadelphia. But when I saw you again and felt your warm breath on my lips, there came such a yearning in my heart to tell you all the unspoken thoughts that I thought you must stay a little longer. A moment, and you were gone. I went to school and prayed God for strength to bear the separation. And I mean, to me, that's an exceptionally mature expression of love and understanding and of duty, of the capacity to hold the personal and the public, in a sense, together and to suppress, not repress, but suppress one's own emotions and desires. I think it's quite remarkable. However, towards the end of 1863 and going on in 1864, no, I'm sorry, I'm wrong there. From 1863, in 1863 into 1864, Charlie was out of touch with Emma for 70 days. He was on campaign in East Tennessee, where General James Longstreet was harassing Knoxville. And he was, as he says, he was in the saddle for 70 days and had no chance to write. And so Emma's anxiety grew greater and greater and greater during that period, to the point of not of madness as it did almost a year later. But I was going to read the letter, but I think I don't have time to do that. We do, in this period, follow a number of military adventures of the Anderson Cavalry, some of which are quite vivid. But towards the end of the period, working on towards the time when Charlie's already discussing resignation with Emma, and when he has been again out on scouts and not being able to communicate with her, she has a terrible dream, which is very short, her report of it anyway. And I think I should read it to you to show you the kind of pressure that she was under at home. She says, "My darling, I pray for you constantly, and last night in my dreams I held a letter from you in one hand, and in the other a dispatch upon which were 3 white angels with black veils. And such a thrill passed through me that I awoke trembling. And your letter, even in my dreams, was unread. Well, she doesn't say much more about it there, but it is clear from a letter from her cousin Annie Reinhardt, which came a few weeks later, that she had written in near madness to Annie, and Annie wrote her back a very stern letter, telling her how she had to get a grip on her emotions and reminding her that if she were called west, if Charlie were injured or wounded, she would have to have a grip on her emotions in order to nurse him. It's a stunning. Both of these letters are really stunning, and they speak so much to the experience of the home front. As I say, to people who are more interested in the warfare, there are also a number of letters during this period to be perused that speak of the war as well. Well, Charlie finally resigned after a long debate with his own conscience and with Emma. He, excuse me, he resigned on the 1st of February, 1865, went home, took up a position on the Pennsylvania Railroad in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, and they were married the 13th of April, 1865, and then settled into a hotel room in Johnstown. Here is a pretty good place to come to almost to a conclusion with I think 2 letters which show conclusively how much these people had grown and how mature their relationship had become. This is Emma's position, final position on Charlie's retirement. She writes on January 22nd, 1865. I did not ask it before when you asked me what you should do about resignation. I would not have asked you to come then because you said you could not conscientiously do it. But now you write, quote, I would resign now if I thought my resignation would be accepted, end quote. And I see nothing in the way. You can ask it now with pride and honor. And I can ask you now freely because you have written the words, I would come home now if my resignation would be accepted. And I hear nothing and see nothing else but these words all the time. Yes, I love you more than I did the day you left me, more than a year ago. But I loved you with all my strength then. But my strength is stronger now. And when I hear you say that you willingly resign, I pray you to do so. I pray you for the love I bear you, which is all my life, to come home to me now, darling. All the warmth and tenderness of my heart are in these words. And then Charlie responds a couple of weeks later, almost 3 weeks, after he receives her letter. And he says, I'm glad, my dear heart, you wrote that letter. I knew it would come. I felt all along that there was a struggle going on in your heart, and that sometime you would give it expression. I see that your great love has taught you to understand my character, as I think I understand yours. I am glad too, my darling, that I can say that I had already done what you had asked in such earnest words, even before your letter was written. I have tendered my resignation and have confident hope that it will be accepted. That's underlined. So much, my darling, to gladden your heart. I sent forward my resignation on the 19th ultimo, strongly endorsed and urged by Colonel Palmer, and I'm now daily expecting to hear from it. I telegraphed at once to Harry to retain the position on the railroad and wrote him what I had done. I also told him, my pretty one, not to say a word to you of it, because I did not wish to give you groundless hope or to disappoint you in case General Thomas should not accept the tender. When the matter was decided, one way or the other, you should know all about it. But your letter of the 22nd will not allow me to wait a final reply before I tell you what I've done to work out the fulfillment of your wishes. By the 10th, I ought to know the decision of headquarters. Should it be favorable, on the 22nd, I will be with you. He was still in the midst of some pretty terrible fighting at the time when he wrote that. So what might a reader learn who is not only reading or not especially reading for the many historical topics of interest that I've already mentioned? We first of all, I think, learn a great deal about the emotions of soldiers and civilians during wartime. Um, and I won't go into that because I think we've just seen a good bit of that. But I would like to say we also learn a great deal about the virtues of soldiers and civilians during wartime, especially at a time when our country was younger and less given to irony, perhaps, or whatever it is we're given to now. For one thing, we see a kind of patriotism that's a rational feeling. They certainly feel their patriotism. They feel for the country, but it's also based on a rational morality. They are fighting for a cause, for the abolition of slavery, and that is, I haven't read anything to that regard in these letters, but it's there and it's in the book. Second, we see an extraordinary courage, and it is the kind of courage that soldiers often speak of, which is that a brave person is not one who doesn't feel fear. A brave person is one who overcomes the fear and does what he or she is called on to do. And we see that both in the soldiers and in the people at home. We see a willingness to sacrifice one's own interests for the common interest in very, very practical and far-reaching ways. We see a strong sense, and this is tied into self-sacrifice, of the priority of family and community over self. That's not to say that they were, say, ancient Greek peasants who had not risen yet to a full sense of their own identity as individuals, but they had not allowed individualism to submerge their sense of belonging to other communities. They also had a strong sense of the fellow humanity of all persons. They did, even these abolitionists did have some prejudice against, or at least they looked down on not only the Irish and on Jews, and these show up in the letters, but even on African Americans, which seems funny for abolitionists. And I can't quite explain it except to say that human beings are complex and we are not simple the way the saints are simple. Most of us are quite divided in our virtues and our vices. They were also very, very sensible of the needs of refugees, both rebel and Union. They were also very sensitive to the needs of wounded, whether rebel or Union. And finally, we see, I think, in Emma and in Charlie and many others in this book, the development of a classical notion of friendship as the friend of the friend as being another self. This is Quaker. We find it in William Penn. The reference is in my book. But of course, Penn is dependent on the Cicero, as Cicero was dependent on Aristotle. So we find this great tradition of classical friendship picked up by Quakerism and then embodied in the thoughts and the actions of these people. And there I leave you with this as if epistolary novel. Thank you very much for listening.
Richard, thank you for that really wonderful, wonderful presentation. And there's a bunch of really interesting questions that have come through. And I wanted to start, and this is a question I wanted to start with, but I think you basically just kind of answered it. But maybe you could put a finer point on it. You know, and I'm glad that you framed this talk as an argument for reading your book as an epistolary novel, right? Because one of the challenges that I came to is certainly as a historical primary source collection gives you insight into, like maybe the military, what's going on in the home front. But when you read these, you get a real sense of that sort of humanity in the letters. I'm thinking about, there's one letter where Emma writes about the death of, I don't know if it was an actual nephew, but Willie Stoddard, and about how it moves her to open up a box where there's a lock of his hair in the box, and you sort of like get a sense of this. You talked about Lizzie Temple dies, and she writes about this, and you get a sort of there's these sort of real moments of humanity and that come out of that. So I'm really glad that you framed your talk in that way, because it helped me better understand the book as I was reading it. My question, and again, maybe if you've already answered this and you can put a finer point on, is why is he a Quaker colonel? Why is that the identifying? Because we've read wartime correspondence, and some of these things often do come out. So what is it that makes him a Quaker colonel rather than all the other ways in which we might identify him, especially considering as you brought up in the beginning, the real tension around what it means to be a Quaker or what it means to be a man in this context. So why the decision to characterize this as a Quaker colonel, as Charlie's a Quaker colonel?
I think, aside from trying to be cute, I wanted to emphasize the interiority and the moral integrity of the Quakers. I'm not a Quaker myself, but I respect them highly. And when I lived back in near Philadelphia, I knew a number, knew some anyway. Actually, I am a Catholic and am very interested in the anti-Ganesh movement up in Cape Breton Island, and it was a movement of Catholic social teaching among fishermen and mine workers, and they were held by Quakers. And there is a line by one of the people involved in that movement that said, the only people who really get the notion of the dignity of the working man are Catholics and Quakers, because they have an interior life. And that was kind of resonating in the back of my mind. And I thought that put Charlie, despite his savoir-faire, and which comes out in the letters too, puts him solidly in this moral world. And I think all his actions are probably ultimately traced back to that. And of course, his mother was a very strong, highly motivated person. And I think that it speaks to her. His father was certainly a good, strong Quaker, and I think probably a good and moral businessman, farmer. But he was not the kind of intellectual force that his wife was, and the Kimber sisters were, and so forth and so on. Does that help?
Yeah, that's great, and maybe a follow up a little bit later. But I also want to get to some of the questions in the Q&A, and I'll kind of combine a couple of them. So one is, could you talk about the postal system of that time and how were these letters delivered to their destinations? And coupled with that, Charlie is like drawing maps and he's writing about movements. So is there censorship that's occurring as these letters are going?
There's no censorship that I can tell. I believe I'm correct in saying that, although I actually never thought to do research on it. But I've seen no evidence of it at all. And I think the evidence of it may be the the fact that the men were grousing against the administration after Antietam, the men and officers, and they were. Lincoln once said that the Army of the Potomac was at this point said that the Army of the Potomac was McClellan's bodyguard, And I think people often take that as just a joke, but I think it was very seriously meant, and that McClellan was actually quite a threat, could have been quite a threat to the government. And I think Lincoln realized that. And yet his letters, we don't have, none survive, but we read traces of them, in his family's letters, responses. His letters were not censored. He was saying, all of the stuff. So that's my feeling. As to the postal system, there was a national postal system, and it I think was probably very good. Emma at one point says, right, one of their friends was George Garreau. He's mentioned once George. He was also an officer in the cavalry. He sent a letter addressed to Taylor's Cedarcroft. Cedarcroft was the name of Bayard Taylor's mansion just outside Kennett Square, and it got there with the address Taylor's Cedarcroft. So the system must have been awfully good. The mail was not delivered, as far as I can tell. You had to go to the post office to pick it up. It became almost public property there after the great battles, because people they wouldn't open each other's mail, but they would read the names and of the addressees, and also of the people who had sent the letters. That they would know who was alive, and they had had some suggestion about who might be wounded or dead. They exchanged information when they at the post office and went to pick up their mail. If they were driving into the post office, some of them was coming away from the post office. Hey, you got a letter from Charlie, yeah. And then the heart would be beating fast, and the anxiety would be removed. And how they got to the camps, I don't know. There must have been some interface between Army postal clerks and the government postal clerks. But then again, I haven't done any research on that, but I suspect, because we do have evidence in letters of Army mail delivery to the officers' tents. The mail guy, the soldier who's the mailman comes in and delivers 85 newspapers in one letter. It's amazing the number of newspapers they took and read. So that's as much as I know, really. It all comes out of the letters.
Yeah, thank you for that. There was a really wonderful line from one of the letters from Emma where she's writing, and she's talking about how the letters aren't coming quick enough, and they stagger in, and she has this beautifully poetic line where they stagger in like soldiers falling out of rank.
Yes.
It's just a really poetic moment where she's just basically saying, your letters are coming in either haphazardly or not quickly enough.
Yeah. Well, it was both. She would often receive a later letter before an earlier letter, as he would too. Sometimes he would, of course, when he was on scouts, he would come back to a bundle of 35 letters because he had not been able to get his mail at all. It was tough. I mean, in those days before cell phones.
Yeah, we have a comment here that I think speaks to this. Thank you for this lovely and informative sharing. This parallels the letters that my parents wrote during World War II, where their relationship evolved from friendship to something much deeper, a true treasure to have read.
Well, that's wonderful. Thank you, whoever wrote that. I'm very glad that came through.
Did you get a sense that in what way was this experience of war coupled with this letter writing? In what way was this instrumental to their relationship?
Well, it wouldn't have survived, of course. It wouldn't have grown. I make the point in the introduction to the book that there is some artificiality in their rhetoric, simply because they knew that everybody was going to be reading. The whole family and even friends might read what they wrote. So there had to be some toning down of emotion. But they manage to communicate their emotions anyway. Emma is, hello there. I've got my little dog right here. He's not as cute as you, though. She was a real master of using the weather to illustrate her emotions. So that's another way that they manage to communicate their real feelings, but still within a kind of more formal rhetoric than we would have used even 40 years ago. I would have used 40 or 50 years ago when I wrote letters to friends, and family. Without the letters, it's who knows, but I think it would have perished. It also, I think, helped them to grow together because they were capable of hashing out differences and talking through difficulties, and of taking positions over against each other without falling apart. I mean, some people get very hurt by that. They are insecure, and disagreement on major issues like the McClellan issue can torpedo a relationship, and yet it didn't with them. And so I think it could only make their relationship stronger and better, as they themselves observed. I don't know if they'd had a telephone, if it would have been the same. As I don't know that if your question and answer person's mother and father had been able to get on the phone from France or the Pacific and talk, whether that would have done the same thing to their relationship, because letter writing is more thoughtful. And you really you do have to think about what you say, because you want to communicate. You don't want to just spew emotion out on the page. You want to make it helpful and profitable to the other person as well as yourself. As she said that maybe we would have been able to work this issue. Here it was the issue of his getting angry at subordinates. They could have worked that through differently if they had been speaking. On the other hand, they were able to work it through very thoughtfully. Unfortunately, we don't have his side of the correspondence, but they were able to work it through quite thoughtfully. So I think it had a lot to do with it.
Yeah, that's lovely. Thank you. We have a question here on your transcription process, and because of the time in which we live, it involves AI. So the question is how much time did it take you to transcribe all of these letters?
Oh, good Lord.
And you discuss some of this in the introduction, and it's apparent in the book, but maybe you could also just talk for the listeners about the decisions you made in that transcription process and how to get them in book form. And the second part of the question is, have you considered how AI might be used to transcribe and interpret letters of this sort?
My training was in the 1970s in medieval manuscripts of both of classical and medieval texts. And then also a little towards the end of that in early modern English manuscripts of the Elizabethan period. I don't know what AI could do with that. I mean, I'm just old. I'm 75 years old. I have really no interest at this point in AI. And I do things the old way. So it took me a long time. I mean, with the way AI apparently gets facts wrong, and I've heard about that. They're apparently the engineers are trying to correct it, but it can put two and two together and come up with 5. I don't know how they could read a manuscript. There are even what are clearly modern manuscripts written by Americans 150 years ago in modern English can be very difficult. And I started working on these, I think probably around, well, but probably around 1999, 2000, somewhere in there. I had to put them aside when around maybe 2010, or a little before that, because I had to do some publishing in order to get tenure, publishing in my own field. And then I picked them up again probably around 2017, 2018. So the transcription part was done by around 2010. And of course, I had full-time jobs throughout that period, so I wasn't working on them full-time. But it took a long time, and I have, I don't know, 3 liquor store boxes full of lined notebook paper with my handwritten transcription on it. And that took an awful long time, but I'm not sure that anyone but a human being can do that. It may well be that a robot will be able to do it someday. Will a robot be able to make the kinds of judgments a text critic makes? My memory is failing me now. The rule that says that you choose the rarer reading, the more difficult reading, the lectio difficilior. That's what it is. I mean, will a robot be able to see that? Which is the more difficult reading? And beyond that, as I've learned with reading English texts, both early modern and modern, will the robot be able to make the judgment that, well, the lectio difficilior here is probably not right. The lectio facilior, the easier reading, is probably right. I mean, it gets, maybe a robot will be able to do that someday. It can't now, and I had to do that. And I think all text critics have to do it now, are still doing that.
Yeah,
of course,
perhaps.
What? Sorry?
I was going to say that perhaps just as there's a value in the time and slow process of writing out a letter, maybe there's also value in the time and slow process of reading through an uncertain hand and trying to decipher meaning. I mean, a sort of follow-up question to that is, do you ever get a sense of from the hand the state of the writer? Can you tell
Oh,
if something
absolutely.
was written hurriedly or with care?
Absolutely. From all the letters of a single person, in other words, from the hand of a person, the general hand of a person, I think you get some sense of the personality of the person. I know that I believe anyway that people have studied this. I have not, but even George Gouraud was something of a megalomaniac, and yet very insecure. Emma was an honest, emotional person. Charlie was a rationalist who also liked to pretend a little bit above his station, perhaps, to be somewhat more of a gentleman. Well, he was a gentleman. I mean, he would have been called that in his day, but I mean, I think maybe he liked to think of himself as a little more suave than he really was. Having grown up on a farm, a large farm, mind you, but a farm anyway, in Kennett Square. So, I mean, yeah, so in general, I think a hand can tell you something about a person. And yes, the ink that's used, the formation of the letters can tell you things too. Even the spacing, because they were very much freer with spacing and with paragraphs and so forth than we are.
Great. And I just want to be mindful of our time here. I was hoping we talked a little bit before the webinar began about your forthcoming work. I was wondering if before our final question, if you could just give a quick update on what have you been working on since publishing this book, and what can we expect later this year?
Oh, thank you very much. I have a book in press with Franciscan University Press about the holy sites of the Jesuit martyrdoms and of the early life of Saint Catherine Tekakwitha in the Mohawk Valley. The Catholic Church, unfortunately, settled on, in my view, settled on the wrong locations for these events, and in my view, the archaeologists of the second half of the 20th century pretty much demonstrated that these events could not have taken place at the Aurasville Shrine, where the Catholic tradition says they did take place. I hasten to add that I don't think that this should diminish the value of the shrines that do exist in the valley, because they will continue to be. I would think they could continue to be, foci for devotion, and then people could just go out and see the actual sites from there. But that should be out anytime. I mean, it's at the printer. I'm
Very
also
well.
working on a long. Right now, it's about 950 lines in Latin hexameter on the martyrdom of Saint Jean de Brebeuf up in Ontario. So I'm on the third revision. So
Retired and active.
yes.
Well,
One has to do that. If you retire and don't stay active, you perish.
Richard, this was really, really wonderful for you to join us. And I just wanted to thank you again for coming out and giving this talk, which I think has really helped me better understand the book, and has given me a certain appreciation for something that I was unable to put into words. So I'm thankful for that. And I wanted to thank also all of our webinar participants. It is recorded and will be posted on our preserve, and will be available for anyone to review and listen to at any point. So thank you very much. Before we head out, I'll hand it back over to Lois.
Thank you, Nate. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes, I'd also like to thank Richard and Nate for such an entertaining talk. It's
you, Lois.
fascinating, and I can't wait to finish Richard's book. So thank you all for coming, and we'll look forward to seeing you soon at another event. Thanks, and have a good evening.